Very interesting stuff there from Panama. Now we're going to take a little bit of a look back at forests. I'm here with Daniel Nelson, one of our other journalists here at oneclimate.net. And Danny's really been following this issue for a while. So we've been talking about it for the past hour and a half or so. We've had some interesting videos and some film reports from around the world that show us what people are facing, what deforestation means, how climate change is impacted by that. We spoke to Siri Sendashonga from Rwanda. She gave us some insights into Central Africa. We heard about what's going on in Indonesia and how people are using technology to monitor the forest and see what's going on. But I really want to dig down to REDD. You know, REDD is what's really going on here, Danny. And it's an extraordinarily complex process that is, in many senses, inside the negotiating hall. It seems like it's almost being brushed off as a fait accompli. It's something that is getting very little dissension. People say it's the least contentious of all the different things that are being negotiated. Whereas out here, we just saw a massive protest of indigenous rights activists, literally linking hands, circling almost this entire massive hall that we're in, shouting "No REDD, no rights." So maybe you can just shed a little more light on what are the issues that indigenous people are facing here and why they're so concerned about REDD.
Well, when you say it's least contentious, I think it's least contentious for industrialized countries because, in a sense, they're saying there's a problem in developing countries of carbon releases on a massive scale. Let's try and stop that. That's 17%, about 17% of carbon emissions. So it's relatively simple if you state it like that. But for the people on the ground who are affected, it's not so simple. And indigenous people, and indeed what are called forest-dependent people, everyone who depends on the forest for their livelihoods and their families and the little businesses that grow up around them, that is literally millions and millions of people.
What does that mean, people are dependent on the forest?
Well, people who make a livelihood out of carrying wood, maybe, or even if there's a big industry that's doing the logging, the little businesses that grow up to support them and transport and look after the families, the little shops in little townships that grow up, every conceivable business. Who takes in the soft drinks? It's millions of jobs. And the people, if this scheme takes off, it's a big international project. And the worry is that in an attempt to move very rapidly and to stop or slow down deforestation, the people who live directly in or off the forest, whose livelihood comes from the forest, will be overlooked. Because the money will go in the first instance probably to central government. It may trickle down to local governments, notoriously corrupt everywhere, even in the industrialized countries. And the people who are dependent on the land won't get a look in. And they may find themselves worse off. Big money attracts people who like big money. It'll attract companies, loggers, con men, all the people that move in. And the indigenous peoples may find that the struggle they've been waging for years to get their rights to the land recognized, they're brushed aside in the rush to cash in on the bonanza.
But Siri Sendashonga seemed to imply that those issues were recognized and they were trying to deal with them before moving forward with REDD.
Well, I think they're recognized because the NGOs have kicked up such a fuss. A lot of the indigenous peoples groups who were left out when this process started, they really were discounted, have pushed themselves in by making a lot of noise and clamor and lobbying. So it is being dealt with, but whether it's being dealt with sincerely and honestly or whether it's, well, we'll put a section in about indigenous peoples and forest-dependent peoples, but that should keep them happy, or whether it's a serious attempt, remains to be seen. There's some very worrying text on the table about about REDD, as it's known, about the forest agreement. Very disturbing, I think.
And you mentioned during our last interview that you were in Cameroon recently, and the logging sector there is notoriously corrupt. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, I don't want the official Cameroon government's spokesman marching down here. And it may be no worse than many other countries, but it's just that it's visible.
Yeah, just as an example of what types of things do happen around the world so people can get a sense of what we're talking about.
Well, basically, it's companies, logging companies, small, medium-sized, and sometimes companies of international repute, move in with their power and money, often in alliance with local bigwigs, politicians or top civil servants, and basically seize land. It's very difficult to resist them. Once they've got the land, they can do what they want. As I say, they're often in alliance with local interests, so it's very hard to stop that. there's also some quite, in the text that's being negotiated, it isn't clear at the moment, and this is being fought over word by word, literally now. The text of RED suggests that companies may be allowed to cut down trees if they replace those cut down trees with new trees in plantations. So there is no net loss of trees. But in cutting down the old forest and replacing it with plantations, there'll be no biodiversity. The animals, the plant life, the insects, everything that goes with old forests will disappear. They don't flourish in a single crop plantation. And the people who lived off the forest will certainly not be allowed in a plantation. That will be a guarded, as it were, gated community. We don't want indigenous peoples in there. We don't want anyone who doesn't belong to the company. This is the big fear. And the last speaker was made this interesting point that in Cameroon and in other countries in that region, it's relatively slow deforestation compared to international rates. Well, there's two things that flow from that. One of them is called leakage in these negotiations, that if Brazil and the other major deforesting nations slow down deforestation, the timber companies are going to move on. They'll think, well, where do we go now? We can't operate so freely here. I know, we'll go to Cameroon. We'll go to Gabon, where the governments are incredibly weak. They do not have jurisdiction. They don't have power. A big company comes in. So through leakage, the problems will then move into these countries. And deforestation may actually speed up as a result of RED, because they're slowing down in one area, pushing the business into another area.
Where there's maybe less ability to monitor and track what's happening.
Yeah, virtually no ability at the moment. And that's why your previous guest was saying governance is absolutely crucial in this. There's no point in having an agreement unless developing countries at the same time, not sometime down the road, are helped to improve the administration that looks after the forest. Without that, this is catastrophe looming.
You've been working around in Africa for many, many years. You've traveled to many countries in the area and in other parts of the world. Do you sense that the concerns about governance, the concerns about corruption and transparency and where the money goes has changed over the years? Are there any better monitoring mechanisms in place now than there were 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
Yeah, it's very hard to say. This varies so much from country to country, but it's certainly gone up the international agenda. At one point, it was the great...
Gone up the international agenda.
Sorry, it's gone up. It was the great unspoken. People didn't like to refer to corruption, even people in the development industry, so-called, in the aid business. Everyone was so concerned to be sympathetic to developing countries, rightly, because they've had a raw deal for many years, that they didn't like to mention corruption, really, because that seemed to bring the problem back to developing countries rather than to the ex-colonial countries that caused most of this mess. But gradually people have realized it is a problem, we have to tackle it. And there's many individuals in developing countries who are bravely fighting it, but there's a long way to go. And as you know, in our own countries, in the US, in Britain, corruption is still there in certain areas massively. It's not something, it's not unique to anybody, but it's just a problem you have to recognize.
What do you mean by the colonial countries that caused a lot of this mess? Can you just give people a little bit of background? Because I think this is new to a lot of our viewers.
Well, I'd pick up on one little remark you made during the interview, which I was listening in, when you said, the ownership issue of the trees has been going on for centuries, a dispute. In a sense, it hasn't been going on. People had societies where they'd worked out this. They lived perfectly well. They knew who owned the trees. If not owned them, they knew who controlled them. They had rights to harvest them under very tight conditions. The colonial authorities introduced entirely new systems which were not necessarily sympathetic, which were not necessarily scientifically based, although many of them thought they were.
So essentially you're talking about when the European and other governments came into Africa and other places and just drew lines and said, this is my area, this is your area.
They drew lines, and then they implemented completely new policies which disrupted the old traditional policies. Not that they were perfect, of course, but they had a way of life, and they were disrupted, but the new policies brought in from outside weren't culturally fitting or suitable. What British administrator knew about tropical forests? We don't have any. Why would they think that they could run them? So they introduced systems, some of which were disastrous. So it's had a huge impact on them. There is one other interesting thing I heard in the corridor the other day. Someone from China was saying, Well, we have prevented through our birth control family planning program, I've forgotten the figure, 100 million births over the last few years. If we're paying people not to chop down their trees, why doesn't the West pay us for not producing 100 million babies that would have been consuming and emitting carbon? So maybe that should be on the table as well.
I have to say to the uninitiated viewer, it sounds like a ransom, paying someone to do something or not do something. It's an interesting concept. We're definitely going to keep an eye on it over the next 10 days or so here at the conference.